So these last three rules for the discernment of spirits, rule 12, 13, and 14, are going to have a very different feel to them than all the rules previous. Largely because Ignatius of Loyola, again, being a Spanish soldier, is kind of basically writing his tactical advice. So now that he's kind of depicted how desolations and consolations work, how you should work with them, now he's talking about tactics to basically engage the enemy. And so Rule 12, which we'll go over today, is all about temptations. Rule 13 is about the enemy's deceits and how to combat them. And then Rule 14 is how Satan actually attacks. So by the end of 3 weeks from today, you should be able to have a full understanding of how to use the arsenal that Ignatius has equipped his soldiers, the Jesuits, with. So in this 12th rule, we'll reflect on the evil one's temptations. And so Timothy Gallagher, who I've referred to before in his Discernment of Spirits books, actually wrote this about a definition for temptation. He calls a temptation a deceptive suggestion from the enemy. A deceptive suggestion from the enemy. It then proceeds on to say this: the enemy works in secrecy in order to shroud his deceits in darkness. He is prowling and looking for our essential weakness, and when he finds it, he attacks with temptations to take down his prey. So basically, it's like the enemy is the roaring lion that Scripture talks about, and he's literally trying to look for the most vulnerable people, those who are actually weak to temptation, to try to take down and exploit. Now, before we read Rule 12 in its entirety, and I'm telling you, it is a very long rule, so you may want to hit pause on this and actually pull up the text just by Googling Ignatius's Rules of Discernment, because it's long and very involved. That also being said, just be warned, this was written in the 16th century. It is not PC. And we'll kind of elaborate and explain that later, and you'll understand why I gave you that disclaimer, so you don't just shut it off as soon as you hear Ignatius's words. So here's Ignatius's 12th rule. The 12th. The enemy acts like a woman, in being weak against vigor and strong of will. Because as it is the way of the woman, when she is quarreling with some man to lose heart, taking flight when the man shows her much courage, and on the contrary, if the man, losing heart, begins to fly, the wrath, revenge, and ferocity of the woman is very great, and so without bounds. In the same manner, it is the way of the enemy to weaken and lose heart his temptations, taking flight. When the person who is exercising himself in spiritual things opposes a bold front against the temptations of the enemy, doing diametrically the opposite. And on the contrary, if the person who is exercising himself commences to have fear and lose heart in suffering the temptations, there is no beast so wild on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature in following out his damnable intentions with such great malice. So now to start off this discussion of this rule, we have to address the elephant in the room, Ignatius's use of language, when he compares the enemy of mankind to a woman. So this is partly because he's writing in a time when women had different social status than they have now. Thomas Green, who is a spiritual author who often reflects on Ignatius' writing, actually said this. He says, Ignatius using the language like a woman is a dangerous comparison to use in our feminist age. Well said, Thomas Green. This indeed may be the case, but Ignatius was not writing it to slam women necessarily. But it was more so on kind of a size thing, of where typically men would be larger, women would be smaller. That's the best way to read into this. David Fleming, another author commenting on this 12th rule, basically just did not like Ignatius's verbiage at all. And so he changed the analogy. And so David Fleming makes this new PC, politically correct, statement of Ignatius's 12th rule. He says, he uses the imagery of a spoiled child. He said, if you are firm with a child who is spoiled, he will soon relent. However, if you show indulgence, the child will have no mercy on the fit he will throw. Now, no matter what imagery we actually decide to settle on, what is most important to kind of realize is that Ignatius is giving this to show us how the enemy's tactics work. The truth that underlines this rule is that the enemy is weak when he is faced with strength. But if we allow him to have strength, then it is us who become weak. The enemy knows that he lacks power against the mighty God. And so one of his tactics is actually to make us forget the divine assistance and to think that we have to resist Satan all by ourselves. And if we were to look at the spiritual life like that, of course we're going to become tepid, scared, slothful, afraid. Because how would we ever win against some beast that's so powerful and omnipotent? Now, if we realize, right, that we have a chance to fight against him through divine grace, we don't lose heart or hope, which is one of kind of the definitions, right, of consolation, is we don't decrease in hope. So let me just use an example of how we give away our will to things that should not have power over us, but do have power of us. So let's say this brand new Netflix series comes out, and you're super excited to watch it, and you watch one episode, and you know that's all you have time for, and you got some work to do, you got to go and take some time for prayer, for reading, got to do some maybe laundry or whatever, mow the lawn, and you watch the first episode, and you're like, that was phenomenal. I've got to watch another episode. And there's a part of you that's like, you know what, it's not what you agreed on. Like you're just going to watch one now and then another one another day. And then sure enough, 3 episodes later, you're like, oh my goodness, I got nothing done. And either you got to skip important chores or tasks that you were slated to do, or else you just stay up to a unhealthy hour. So now what we see right in this example is the temptation. I gave my will away to say, Netflix is stronger than me. Versus, right, if I were to say, oh, come on, it's just a show. Like, it'll always be there. I'm just going to keep moving forward. I can give or take it. The same thing is actually true with the enemy. Is if we're like, this wasn't that bad, or this is okay, it's not too terrible. We just kind of give it a little bit more credence. And after a while, his hooks are so deep in us, it's very hard to pull away. St. Thomas Aquinas actually, from his life, gives us an amazing example of the power found is if you resist an enemy, what actually happens. Now, Thomas Aquinas, in his young life, he was born into a very wealthy family who actually tried to get him to become a Benedictine monk at Monte Cassino, one of the famous Benedictine monasteries in Europe. And Aquinas went there. It was not for him. And he came back and he heard about the Dominicans, and he was very fascinated. He wanted to live with this mendicant order, which basically meant they begged. Now, if you can imagine, right, he comes from a very wealthy, well-known family, and now he's saying, I want to become a beggar. The family's like, no way. So they lock him up in this tower, and they actually bring in a prostitute in the dead of night, because they think, if Thomas Aquinas breaks his vow of chastity, then he'll be ruined and he'll just have to be normal. So sure enough, the brothers throw in this prostitute. Aquinas is in there, and the next thing they knew, the prostitute is clamoring, clawing on the door to get out of the room. Because what Thomas had done when the prostitute had come on to him is he went over to the fire, grabbed a hot poker, and chased her out of the room. Then once she finally left the room, he took the poker and drew a cross on the wall, and then dropped to his knees and prayed. Now, the legend is that after that happened, angels actually came and tied an invisible cord around his waist to grant him the grace of perpetual chastity, because he had resisted that temptation so heroically. But again, what Thomas knew, right, is if you just act strong against the temptation, it's amazing how much it goes away. But if it's like, this is so much stronger than I have room, I can't fight it. I can't fight it. It's got too much power over me. This is where we really do lose and fall into sin quite quickly. The spiritual life is very much so, as we've talked about several times over, about awareness, of just not losing our bearings when something is actually taking place. So for example, when Aquinas was being tempted, he didn't think like, oh, this is helpless or I have to do this. He realized that he could actually fight and battle it. Now, another natural analogy, not to go so spiritual into the lives of the saints, is if you're going to nature and you confront a black bear. Black bear, not a grizzly, black bear. And with the black bear, right, is it gets spooked easy. However, if you run from a black bear, typically it would actually run after you. But if you make yourself big and you make some noise, oftentimes the black bear will get scared away. So again, looking very much so at the analogy that St. Ignatius gives, is the more that we actually put force into resisting the temptation, oftentimes the sooner it'll actually break. If we resist the enemy, he will run, as he realizes who is behind us is the power of God, right, in our baptism. And so with the power of God, he doesn't even stand a chance. This is again where Ignatius says, when faced resolutely, the fundamental weakness of the enemy is revealed. So, and I'm sure you've experienced this, right, if we're honest with ourselves, is there's time we're tempted, maybe it's not even to sin, but just maybe imprudence, right? And we're kind of like, I just don't know, and I don't know if I can resist this, and is it really that big of a deal? And the more we kind of let that thought process go, the harder it is to backtrack out of those kind of slippery slopes. Now, if we look at our own heart and conscience, and we simply just ask ourselves, so how big have we made the devil in our life? It's actually quite revealing. Because the more power that we give to him, the more power he has. When he draws near to tempt us, do we have kind of a fatalistic approach to say, I just can't beat this? Or are we actually trying to want engaging and fighting this battle? Honestly, this is so important for our life. Because we all as human beings, we lie to ourselves, right? And I'm just coming from dinner now, and I know I did not need 4 pieces of large pizza. I did not need that. However, I convinced myself you don't want to put it in the fridge, and you didn't really eat anything else today. I promise you, tomorrow I am going to be kicking myself because I had 4 pieces of pizza. But in that moment, I was like, I can have this. No, Nate, you can't. Your metabolism's slowing down. You can't do it. But I just keep lying to myself. Now, this is just a small example, but we do this in so many areas of our life, and that's why we kind of go down the trail of placating the enemy, when really we should actually see it for what it is at the beginning. Father Gallagher uses a brilliant imagery about this in his book. He uses the imagery of a snowball. And he just talks about how if a ball is rolling down a hill with snow, if you stop it right at the beginning, it's not a big deal. It's just this little thing, and you pick it up and boom, you go away. However, the more that it goes down the hill, the larger it gets, the harder it is to stop without a lot of force, right? And so Gallagher's imagery is just so beautiful because it's really showing us that if we are willing to battle a temptation head on right when it starts, it's going to be a lot easier to combat. Versus if we actually kind of let it keep rolling, it's really hard once the train is so far down the track. Another unnatural analogy to use is if you've ever been up to Itasca, Minnesota, right? It's right where the Mississippi River starts. And Itasca is actually, it's a cool origin story for the name. It was named by a Catholic man who called it, it's Veritas Capitis, which means true head in Latin. And they actually combined Veritas Capitis into Itasca. And so it's not a Native American word, which it sounds like. It's actually 2 Latin words that are smushed together. But Itasca is the true head of the Mississippi. And you can literally just walk across it, no problem. However, if you go all the way down to southern Louisiana, there is no way you can wade across that water. You got to take a boat because it's so incredibly wide. Again, the same analogy is if you start right at the beginning, it's so much easier to overcome than if you wait till it gets too much momentum. The temptations of the enemy work in a similar manner. If we stop and resist them right away, they flee. If we let them gather, they get stronger and stronger. Now, I have done this so many times in my life in regards to prayer, right? Where I'll be like, okay, I've had a really busy day. I got to pray. I just got to get that one email off. Or, that person texted me, or hey, I just got to call this one person quick. And I just keep pushing prayer off just a little bit, just a little. I'm going to get to it. But then someone sends me a funny YouTube link, and then I go down a YouTube black hole, or then someone calls and they say, hey, you want to meet up? And I get back after meeting up with someone, I'm like, oh man, I didn't pray tonight. And it's just so easy, because if we don't kind of put a stop to it right now and say, no, this is the most important thing, it's amazing how hard it is to retreat. The evil one will back up his original proposals, like, hey, you don't need to pray, just do this one thing quick. Was saying, how about this? You wanted to watch this show, how about if you pray while you're watching the show? Or, remember, tomorrow you're going to have to drive 3 hours to get to this one place. You can pray the entire 3 hours in the car. You don't need to pray today, just save it all for tomorrow. See, the enemy is very convincing, right? And that's how he gets so much ground. He's kind of great for working in our mind. But what we have to do as Christians is to use that right reason to say, no, I plan on doing prayer. I have to do it now. And if we stand firm in those prior proposals before kind of temptation rears its ugly head, it's a lot easier to grow in virtue rather than just kind of fall into luck in the spiritual life. If we stand and say, I am going to pray right now, no matter what, it's amazing how quickly the enemy scatters, right? And I think we've all experienced this, right? Especially around food, where we're like, oh, should I have this? Should I not have this? And then you're like, no, I'm not going to eat it. And the temptation just goes away. It's amazing. This is why St. Ignatius uses the imagery of a woman who is related to a man. In our modern world, the imagery of the spoiled child or the parent might be better, but if one lets the temptation gain ground, it becomes harder and harder to resist. But as soon as we stand firm, it's gone. So one option that we human beings do not get to have is that we do nothing in regards to temptation. You actually have to choose to respond in some way. Either we resist or we allow it to take just a little bit more hold of us. Because in the end, we're always moving between two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the enemy. Both of them have very clear plans for our life. The longer that we look at a temptation without actually going against it, the stronger it'll get. And the more blind we'll become to it, and just the more that will kind of convince us, like, that is the best decision. I should do the wrong thing. Now, here's an analogy of it. And I came across this. I don't remember where I came across it. I wish I could give credit to who really created it. But it's an imagery that I didn't actually know about until I had read the commentary on it. It's about a sentry in the Middle Ages. So apparently, when people were taking watch of a middle-aged city in the middle of the night, there would be multiple shifts at the same time. And the reason why is one would be close to the fire warming themselves. But they realized the closer you got to light, the worse your night vision got. So if your job was to not die of cold at night and to keep watch in the night, what they would do is one person would warm themselves, and then the other one would go out away from the fire, allow their eyes to adjust to the darkness so that they could see farther into the night. And then after so much time, boom, they would switch. Boom, they would switch. So they could maximize their ability to see. Now, the reason I like this imagery, right, is because the longer you stare at the fire, the harder it is to see what's actually going on in the darkness. The longer we stare at a temptation and engage it and play with it, the harder it is to see the real picture. If we keep looking at the temptation, it actively becomes more and more intriguing. We kind of lean in because it's warm, it's enticing, it's comfortable, and then boom, it's got us. Now here's another analogy though, is you can see this actually in what's called exposure therapy, and it's if they're trying to get someone to overcome a phobia. And so if someone is deathly afraid of like spiders or dogs or a zombie, oftentimes what the therapist will do is to help the person be in proximity to the thing that they're terrified of until basically they don't have like the huge reaction. And so the more that they have encounters with it, the more their kind of guard would go down and they don't see it as terrifying. The longer one stares at these things that frighten them, right? The longer they actually kind of become captivated by them. And so you see this in horror movies, right? If someone's hasn't done this exposure therapy, not to see it as a danger, but like they'll literally be like, there's, that cinema effect where it's like they're looking at something that's like, and the person's frozen and they can't move. That's exactly what it's like when we've looked at sin for too long. However, if we're able to kind of just like see it, right, and be like, okay, yep, there's a temptation. It's okay. I'm not going to fall into it. I'm just going to keep moving on. Then what happens is it loses its intensity. So we realize, okay, yep, it's not going to kill me. God is all powerful. I'm okay. Versus having to like run with terror from every single temptation that comes up. Again, we don't grow in kind of a overcoming of it by indulging the temptation, but just by realizing, you know what, it's not good for me, but God is far powerful. I can actually resist it. And then we don't actually get kind of transfixed in fear of it. We cannot forget that we're talking about an enemy through all of this, right? Ignatius, again, is using battle imagery. An enemy does not want our benefit at all. And an enemy is someone that you would never let your guard down in front of. So if you knew someone was going to try to hurt you, there is no way you're going to be like, what am I going to do today? No, you're totally watching and on guard because you know at any moment something could happen because the enemy doesn't want you there. Satan is ruthless, but he's also weak. So if we make him powerful in our eyes, he has already won. But if we put him in his place, after affirming what is true, with God all things are possible, and also realizing like the more I engage the temptation, the worse that it gets, the enemy will flee. He is a coward. St. Francis of Assisi has this beautiful, very rarely quoted saying. He says, if the servant of God, as may happen, is disturbed in any way, he should rise immediately to pray, and he should remain in the presence of the Heavenly Father until he restores unto him the joy of salvation. So another way to actually phrase this is if someone thinks that the sin is so powerful that they can't overcome it with God's grace, how they need to respond is actually to rise, to pray, and to stay in the presence of God until the temptation is actually overcome. This drawing near to God is a beautiful way to fight against the enemy, as it's like a child who gets frightened and they don't overcome their fear by actually battling it. They overcome their fear by running to their mom or their dad. And in running into their arms of embrace, they feel totally at peace and at ease. The same thing is actually true with us as Christians when we are tempted very, very intensely. By running into the arms of our Father, eventually the fear will subside. Now, one of the most powerful weapons to use against the enemy is the one thing that he has none of, which is humility. When Satan is proposing temptations like, you can't do this, or you're a failure, or just put off praying, it really hasn't done anything for you anyways, we can actually engage God's nuclear weapon, which is humility. And it does a great deal to resist temptations. When we're able to say very firmly, as has been mentioned before, I can't, he can, he promised. A beautiful act of humility and surrender to God in time of temptation. Now, another weapon of humility that I found to be very helpful is when temptations arise to simply say to God, not the enemy. We never dialogue with the devil. We are talking to God. To tell God this, God, please just love me in my weakness. Love me right here where I am being tempted. Because I think sometimes, right, like when we're being tempted to something that we're not proud of, we actually don't feel good about ourselves, right? And so we don't actually want to be near God. But if we can make the petition to say, God, will you love me in the midst of my trial and tribulation? It actually invites that act of humility and to help God fight for and with you. If the snowball of temptation is already rolling and we have not resisted, we have to realize that it is not too late. It's not like one of those things where like, oh, you're a little dirty, just throw yourself in the mud. Exodus 14:14, which is really one of my favorite passages in the scripture, it says, do not be afraid, God will fight for you. And so, for example, let's say like there's kind of thresholds in temptation. So you get tempted to one thing and you kind of fudge it and boom, you move into the next one. And then you're kind of on this threshold where you're like, you know, I can choose if I want to do that or not. To really say, okay, just because I've fallen in the past does not mean I'm hopeless and have to keep on falling into it. At some point, I can stop that ball from rolling. Or to go back to that imagery and the analogy of the spoiled child, if let's say this child's throwing a fit, I'm like, fine, here's a piece of candy. And they wait a while, and then they throw another fit. And I want a pop. I want a soda now. And you don't want to tell the child, no, because you've already given them candy. And in fact, if you tell them no, they're like, well, you already gave me candy, so why can't I have pop? They're both sugary. This is how the enemy works, right? Well, you've already fallen into this, so why can't you do that too? But we as Christians know that at every single moment, we are given the ability to choose and to call out to God for help. It is never too late. The enemy loves to work in a way that convinces us of absolutes, that there's no chance, there's no tomorrow, there's no hope. This is not the language of God. And thus again, we cannot dialogue with the devil. These statements from the enemy that I just mentioned, things like, you already have to go to confession, you might as well keep on going, or see how powerless you are, you can never resist my temptations, or you went this far, why don't you go just a little bit further? These things are not true. And it's just like we're that sentry that's looking into the fire too long. It's like we can't see the full picture anymore because our eyes have been so focused by the temptation and the sin. And thus Ignatius's 12th rule again has such profound wisdom that talks about if we're willing to actually go against and resist the temptation, we are assured of an absolutely amazing victory if we can just run into the arms of our Father and help to resist that enemy that is actually quite weak in the whole scope of God's incredible power.